Vladimir Nabokov knew that writers that were going to become legends, writers that were going to populate bookshelves for centuries to come, had to have three different elements. And today we are going to hear Nabokov speak at length about those three elements. And I'm going to tell you how to activate those elements within your soul, because my name is Ian and I am here to champion the literary renaissance, a movement that will surpass modernism and postmodernism and pull us out of the post-literate lull that we are stuck in right now. But enough for me. Let us now hear from Nabokov. There are 3 points of view from which a writer can be considered. He may be considered as a storyteller, as a teacher, and as an enchanter. A major writer combines these three: storyteller, teacher, enchanter. But it is the enchanter in him that predominates and makes him a major writer. To the storyteller, we turn for entertainment, for mental excitement of the simplest kind, for emotional participation, for the pleasure of traveling in some remote region in space or time. A slightly different, though not necessarily higher mind, looks for the teacher and the writer. Propagandist, moralist, prophet. This is the rising sequence. We may go to the teacher not only for moral education, but also for direct novel, for simple fact. Finally, and above all, a great writer is always a great enchanter. And it is here that we come to the really exciting part when we try to grasp the individual magic of his genius and to study the style, the imagery, the pattern of his novels or poems. And this is a genius quote by Nabokov, because I talk about all the time how no matter what genre of art you are in or whatever medium you are in, that your job is to wake people up by enchanting them. It is to lull them into your story and show them not just a different reality, but awaken deep aspects within themselves that may have been asleep since childhood, since before they even came to this earth. Because obviously, if we look at the bottom of the barrel in the literary world, which are books that are written for entertainment, it's easy as literary and avant-garde writers to kind of laugh them off. But I loved that David Foster Wallace, when he was teaching his literature and creative writing classes, made his students read Conan the Barbarians, Mary Higgins Clark, and a bunch of other airport rack novelists, because he understood that most people who, especially young writers that are ambitious, if you are a young writer right now, or if you are in the writing game and you are pretty new, then you eventually probably want to write like your idols. And when you read a Cormac McCarthy novel, when you read a Nabokov novel, we like to fixate on the enchanting. But when you look at how Nabokov, first and foremost, is an entertainer, even in something like Pale Fire. I mean, if you look at the foreword to Pale Fire, it is one of the more entertaining things that Nabokov ever wrote. And it was to kind of lull you and get you ready to read this 999 line poem broken up into 4 different cantos, and then the off-the-walls analysis at the end. And some big decisions have to be made, because I like to hope that one day I will inspire or even try to even get close to the aura of a David Lynch. Because if you look at a Blue Velvet or even The Elephant Man or some of his other movies, yes, they are very avant-garde, but they have all the entertainment elements lined up perfectly. You know, Frank, or whatever his name is, in Blue Velvet breaks out in a Roy Orbison song. And speaking of entertainment, you know, if you just look at Lolita, you know, Humbert's self-justifications and kind of poetic play with, you know, with puns and all those other things keep you entertained. It keeps you kind of moving through the story. If you look at Nabokov's 1957 novel, which many people haven't read, it's one of his least read novels, Pinine, if I am saying that correctly, it is an ironic novel about this professor who is awkward and his communication is off. And there are some almost juvenile moments of humor that Nabokov integrates into the novel. And when I think about a lot of the best novels ever written, in my opinion, even though this isn't a definitive list, these are just coming to my head because I read them this past year and did massive courses and book clubs on them. Infinite Jest, very funny. Gravity's Rainbow, very funny. A lot of Cormac McCarthy novels, very funny. Charles Cambotier, whatever his name is, in Nabokov's Pale Fire, just going on rant in the analysis. Super funny. Like, just laugh out loud. Like, I'd be sitting there reading and being like, what the fuck is going on? Like, why is he talking about this kingdom still? I see it behind me right here, Confederacy of the Dunces by John Kennedy Toole. Hilarious novel. And that's what's so intense about high level novel writing when you are dealing with geniuses, when you are dealing with people who were born talented, born into families of professors, born rich, and who trained for decades for their, big opportunity to write a masterpiece of a novel, that they are skilled at dialogue. They are as good of writers as comedy as many stand-up comedians are. They just don't have the performance aspect down. They are beautiful at writing settings and making you feel emotions. Like, there are so many different things happening at high level fiction writing. And that's why I think it is the artistic medium with the most room for complexity. And so many people forget that that's where we started, that we started as storytellers. And because I can, let's make this personal really fast. The other day I received some nasty comment from a fan of the show, and I think I had talked about some author that he liked, or he kind of misunderstood one of my videos. And he was like, "I'm not listening to you anymore. Anyone who thinks nature poetry is good fucking sucks. I'll read my Shakespeare." And I didn't reply, but I'll reply now. That oral storytelling is still the axiomatic root of all literature. And the root of oral storytelling, the a priori of all of that, is experiences out in nature, animistic experiences, and finding art through anticipation. And so long before we had religions and civilization, people were telling stories about what they encountered out in nature. So now we move on to one of my favorite things, which is obviously teaching within novels. A lot of the wake up artistry that I was talking about earlier happens when you are the propagandist, when you've kind of moved someone into your novel and then you enshrine them or fill them up with a philosophical framework in a sneaky way. And long before kind of Nabokov started writing more experimental and progressive novels like Pale Fire and Lolita, he wrote an invitation to a beheading, which kind of reminds me like a Camus or a Kafka novel. It has a lot of absurd elements that really kind of remind me of like that Charlie Chaplin movie, The Dictator, in a weird way, The Great Dictator or whatever. But it was kind of Nabokov's rebuke against all the repressive regimes manifesting in Russia and in Europe. And I think it came out in the 1930s. And around that time, many people obviously were having to contemplate that in art. That book is so weird because like he is like doing stream of consciousness and like integrating political commentaries and like characters searching for like existential freedom and people exploring like the collective unconscious. It's actually a pretty good book by Nabokov. And a line I love from that novel is that one of the characters, Cincinnatus, if I remember correctly, is condemned for Gnostical turpitude, if I'm saying that correctly, which is just like, kind of being against the morals of general society. And in some ways, this kind of set up, some of the over moralization and kind of the more extreme takes and kind of play with morality that Nabokov starts to explore later on. Because to step up and do something like Pale Fire, which is kind of like knocking down the fourth wall, where we have, Kimboti, who is now mad, and he rants like throughout the entire book about not, projecting your desires and your reality onto art, as he's doing that the entire time. Like, to be able to pull that off in such a clever way requires a grand vision. And something that I've noticed is that, and I talk about this a little bit in my video, How to Write a Philosophical Novel, that many of the great philosophical novels behind me have somewhat unique structures that if you can find like the impetus of an idea, if you can get the creative urge for something beautiful and then tether that to a kind of a progressive structure, then suddenly you are on the way to being able to just kind of write, and a lot of the kind of philosophical stuff will just work its way into the novel. Because I see a lot of people who write, one could say, a novel that isn't very unique in structure or scope or from, the everyday average novel, but they are trying to infuse, their radical Christian anarchism or whatever other philosophy or idea through one of these characters. And it just kind of feels off. It either falls flat or it feels too preachy. And one thing to note that I think that a lot of people miss out, and something I think that we've failed at as kind of a community, because if you look at the publishing industry over the last couple decades, we could go, and I'm willing to go there and would probably say so, that, the publishing industry has imploded because the dark forces of reality, the men behind the curtain want us to remain in ignorance, that they don't want the most transformative industry, the industry of knowledge to be flourishing because power structures would fall. And so we've been kind of herded into this kind of market of marginalized voices and ideas. And there have been some spectacular novels that maybe would have never been published within that genre, or I should say kind of pushed in the industry. But because it was forced by diversity quotas and DEI and all these other things, and that is a fact, whether you agree with that or not, that's what happened. But the difference is that if you look at the 1980s and the early 1990s with people like the Wu-Tang Clan, if you look at The Teacher, KRS-One, Dead Prez, Immortal Technique, RZA, the real lyricists from the 90s, they were independent and they were teaching people and unifying people about ideas and problems that most people didn't know about. I've heard RZA talk about this before, but he didn't, when he heard NWA, he didn't know what was going on. He didn't know that there were these crazy riots and this crazy police brutality happening over on the West Coast because he was disconnected over on the East Coast. Social media and the news wasn't that big of a thing yet. And so rap music, poetic lyricism through hip hop was a means of teaching people. And like I said, when you look at some of the artists that I was just speaking about, that was a big part of the community. But if you look at what they were doing, they weren't scared. They weren't worried about the HR department. They weren't worried about being canceled. They were rugged. They were tying themselves to Bushido and had Outcast members like Old Dirty Bastard and all this crazy shit going on. But if I look at guys like Tommy Orange, who I think is a great novelist, and others, and funny enough, I've actually spoken to Tommy Orange, and I went partially on this rant to him because he's from San Francisco and he knows about the hyphy movement. Everybody knows about Mac Dre and E40 and all those cats from San Francisco in the 1990s. Zion I, they were killing the rap game. And they were teachers. And so this whole kind of diversity push and this kind of direction we've gone in as a publishing industry, I think would have gone way better. And actually we could have kind of moved through it. And I wouldn't have to come on here and rant about the literary renaissance if the people in it had some courage. If everyone wasn't worried about looking over their shoulder to get canceled, and if they weren't canceling themselves and each other, like I've talked about countless times on this channel before. Because if you look at the rap industry, they're talking about hitting women and doing drugs and selling drugs and killing people. And even though many of us don't morally agree with that, and those guys are really just fictionalizing stuff that never happened to them, if you do something innovative like rap, if you are on the groundbreaking edge of something, which could be the structure of your novel, and you aren't afraid to be edgy, suddenly people will listen to you. Suddenly you can start to educate people. And that was a beautiful metaphor to the point I just made about structure, that rap in the 1990s was structurally evolving. There were people like RZA who was sampling, disco beats and some of the R&B from the 70s and early 80s and progressed the entire industry. And, and they combined that with lyricism because RZA and Jizza were members of the Nation of Islam. And even though I think, the Nation of Islam is insane, as we saw with Malcolm X and many other members, they are a very serious organization in terms of education and other things and sobriety. And so the Wu-Tang Clan and guys like Tupac and others, had this, whose mom was a revolutionary and educated him. They had this major opportunity and they took advantage of it. And that was eventually kicked off track by more of the ignorant rappers like Jay-Z and Biggie Smalls and Lil Wayne and Kanye West. And now if you understand underground rap, there are some of the greatest lyricists ever out there. There are people that make Kendrick Lamar look like Limp Bizkit. I wish I could just rant about rap all day in relation. And I love to talk about this because I always say, guys, look how hard hip hop artists work. They go on tour. They push their mixtapes. I haven't told the story in a second, but 6 months ago, I was in Tucson walking around, and there was this guy who walked up to me as I was walking into a used bookstore, and he was trying to make me buy his CD. I don't even have a CD player anywhere in my house. I have a cassette player. And he's like, hey, buy my CD, give me $20. I'm like, hey, man, I'm not that interested. I love rap, but, not today. And he's like, no, you're fronting, bro. And he starts rapping for me so I'm walking in. He follows me into Bookman's and kind of lowers his tone, but is still rapping for me as I'm walking around the store, trying to sell me on this CD. How many of you are have that energy with your novel? How many of you guys have a physical copy of something that you were trying to give to people? How many of you guys have a social media presence and are like doing everything you can to get your work into people's hands? Not many of you guys. And I'm not rapping for people at the bookstore either. I heard a story about the rapper Immortal Technique back in the 90s. He got out of prison and he had all this conscious revolutionary rap, but no label wanted to publish him. So he had this record that he recorded, Revolutionary Volume 1, and he would work all night at these crazy jobs. And then in every moment of his free time, he would sleep on couches and use all of his money to just hand CDs out to people. And like in some crazy span of time, like a couple months, he handed out like 10,000 CDs on the streets of New York and eventually got the momentum to start being more recognized. You could get a batch of 500 books for about $6 each. So if you could save $3,000, which is a lot for a lot of you guys, but if you worked your ass off and got $3,000, you could have hundreds of books to go give out away for free at a book festival or something like that. That isn't very practical advice, and I would recommend many other things before that. But that type of energy comes when you want to teach something, when you have something to say, when you've experienced something and want to share that with the world. That does not come from someone who just got their MFA and they want a fellowship, or I'm just, I have a job and I've always wanted to be a writer. That energy doesn't come from that. And so last but not least, yes, a writer is an enchanter. And this is the most important part, that if you can enchant people, you could be missing certain elements. If you can enchant people with your writing and with your persona, there is so much that you can do. And that's why I hate to say it like this, it sounds so weird, but building a personal persona and reputation as a writer is so important, because almost everyone else behind me had a full marketing team doing it for them. And guess what? You're not going to have one. And so priming people to view you a certain way and then having them enter your world and already being enchanted is one of the most underrated things in general. And then if you deliver, it's like, having a crazy title and thumbnail, and then you watch like the best video ever on YouTube. You're like, damn, that was really good. And that's why I like the word enchanting, because it's bigger than just the text. Why are there people like me who have many other interests, you guys? I've taught yoga for over a decade. I have a wife, I have kids, I have pets, I have hobbies. Why am I sitting here and making over 200 videos on Cormac McCarthy? Why am I going to make 100 videos plus on Nabokov and on countless other authors? I could be, if I wanted to make money in the fastest way possible, there are plenty of other niches that would make that happen for me. But it's because I have been enchanted by these men and women. I have the utmost respect for them. And obviously, enchanting is what makes Nabokov so good, being progressive with his style and how he uses words and sentence structure and, kind of the odd plots of his novel, being, taking a risk, writing about a predator and underage sex in Lolita. I should have mentioned that a little bit ago. Writing about, a chess schizophrenic or a chess maniac. I could walk through all of his novels, but Nabokov tells interesting stories. He draws you in. They are never told from a very simple point of view, and they never feel hard either. That's something that I've noticed a lot, running my free writing school. I read a lot of short stories from, people who, I'm friends with or know from my online writing community. And speaking of my Substack, I am releasing free daily poems throughout all of 2025, everybody. I am also posting a ton of free translations and a ton of cool stuff over on my Substack. I also follow and repost a bunch of really cool authors over there. So if you're trying to kind of be a part of the literary renaissance, it is happening on Substack.com, not just on my profile, but on everyone else's profile. If you want to be taken seriously as a fiction author or a poet in 2025, then you need to be on Substack, because the Kindle graveyard is dead. Modern publishing is dead. Substack is the place to become a full-time writer. But what I've noticed is that, a lot of these men have beautiful writing styles. They know sentence structure. They got all this ambition. But when I read their work, it's heavy, and I feel like I'm getting no real payoff. And I've done a couple experiments. I'm like, is this just me? Am I just projecting my feelings? But I will read someone's short story, and then I will go find an author I like and go find one of their short stories in the New Yorker or wherever online in a journal and read it on the same computer screen in my same mentality. And I don't know if it's because I've been primed and enchanted by them, but it feels totally different. And so I'm having an itch to go off on another tangent, but I'm going to simmer it down right now. I want you guys to be a part of the literary renaissance, whether you are reading stuff over on Substack or writing stuff on Substack. Go check it out. I will see you guys over there and have a great night.